Hey, what's going on, guys? Starfield just got a new update. The biggest talking point right away is that freeze fix while traversing a planet's surface, because that is the sort of bug that can hit you at the exact moment you are finally getting into a groove, and then everything just locks up for no good reason. On top of that, Bethesda also says it has addressed issues tied to major incursions, Terran black boxes, and incursion icons, which tells me they are still very much smoothing out the new content path as players keep pushing through it. And that matters because Starfield is one of those games where the little friction points stack up fast. One bad freeze, one broken objective, one icon that refuses to disappear, and suddenly the whole mood changes. So when a patch shows up with a focus on stability and progression cleanup, I do think that is worth paying attention to. Bethesda is not trying to sell this as some massive feature drop. This is more of a repair pass, the kind that keeps the game from tripping over itself while players are actually trying to enjoy the new stuff. That approach makes a lot of sense here, especially with the current wave of incursion-related content still fresh in people's hands. Now, looking at the actual notes themselves, the first thing that jumps out is how much of this patch is aimed at preventing weird states before they turn into full-blown headaches. There is the planet surface freeze fix, sure, but there are also fixes for black box incursions not starting or resetting properly, which is exactly the kind of progression bug that can make a questline feel stuck even when you're doing everything right. There's also a crash tied to placing a designer couch aboard a ship, which is such a specific problem that it almost sounds funny until you remember how many players love decorating ships and outposts and how quickly a small decoration bug can become a real annoyance. Bethesda also fixed an infinite load that could happen if a data slate display was placed aboard a ship, and that is another one of those issues that feels tiny until it completely blocks you from moving on. The gameplay side of this update is doing a lot of quiet heavy lifting too. Bethesda says it fixed an unresponsive state that could happen when trying to go through load doors while using the scanner, which is the kind of thing that makes you stop and stare at the screen wondering why your controls suddenly stop cooperating. There's also a fix for Delta being the wrong size, which sounds almost playful until you remember that visual bugs can really stand out in a game this detailed. Quantum Essence also got attention since it could be used from favorites even when none was available, and that is a sneaky one because it can mess with player expectations in a way that feels like the game is lying to you. On top of that, Bethesda cleaned up a few points of interest so they do not show up on planets with no human presence, and it addressed a space encounter that was spawning too many asteroids, so there's definitely a mix here of balance, presentation, and straight-up bug cleanup. Then there is the UI side, and this is where a lot of players are probably going to notice a nicer day-to-day experience. If you have loaded into a save and seen incursion icons sitting around on the star map when they should not be there, that gets cleaned up now. Bethesda also fixed an unresponsive state in the vehicle menu, which is the kind of menu bug that makes a feature feel worse than it really is because it interrupts the flow every single time you want to use it. They also handled a texture issue that could appear on characters during character creation, plus a text string problem that could make the font display incorrectly. And yes, even the game credits got updated, which is not the first thing anyone will post a clip about, but it does show the patch was not just about one or two fixes. It was a broader housekeeping pass across the whole experience. What I keep coming back to with this patch is that Bethesda seems to be targeting the kinds of issues that cause people to lose momentum. Not just crashes, but interruptions. Not just broken quests, but awkward states where the game is technically running and still feels stuck. That is a pretty important difference. A freeze on a planet's surface can kill the sense of exploration. A broken incursion flow can make a new system feel unreliable. A weird UI icon can make the map feel messy. These are not giant cinematic problems, but they absolutely affect how long people stay in the game before they decide to call it a night. So, while this update may not be overflowing with brand new toys, it is clearly meant to make the current content land better in actual play. And that is where the update starts to make more sense when you think about the bigger Starfield picture. Bethesda has been spending a lot of time in this phase of the game, where the goal is not just adding things, but making the added things behave properly. That means less time wrestling with busted icons, fewer weird ship crashes, fewer progression hiccups, and less of that irritating moment where you know the issue is not your fault, but you still have to reload anyway. For a game that leans hard on exploration and long sessions, stability is not a side note. It is part of the whole experience. A patch like this helps the game feel more dependable, and dependability matters more than people sometimes admit. The thing is, this also tells a story about where the game has been lately. Bethesda has not been shy about patching systems related to the new Incursion content, and the fact that this update calls out major incursions, Terran black boxes, and incursion icons suggests those are areas they are still actively smoothing out. That kind of support is reassuring in its own way, because it means the problems are being tracked and not just left to linger, while everyone hopes they disappear on their own. When a live game is in this kind of maintenance rhythm, the best patches are often the ones that do not call too much attention to themselves. They simply make a game less annoying to live with, and this one feels very much like that kind of update. Now, stepping back to the previous update, that one was also focused on polish, but it leaned a bit more heavily into crash fixes and gameplay cleanup. Bethesda said it contained multiple fixes for crashes and stability, plus gameplay and quest fixes, and the detailed notes showed some of the bigger trouble spots. It addressed crashes when viewing creations, crashes that could happen during autosaves, crashes involving legacy data in creations, and a crash tied to removing certain types of items in outpost mode. On the gameplay side, it fixed Muria-consuming ammo, adjusted the plasma cutter so unintended legendary effects would not show up, prevented mineral farms from appearing on Earth, and increased the frequency of colony war action heroes. There were also quest fixes for Into the Void and Lone Wolf, so that patch had a nice mix of technical cleanup and actual playthrough repairs. So when you put the two updates side by side, the pattern becomes pretty clear. The earlier one was about clearing out some of the bigger crash and progression problems that had probably been bothering players for a while. This newer one feels more focused on the fresh edges of the game, especially incursion-related systems, menu behavior, and those odd little states that can hang around after a few hours of play. In other words, Bethesda is still in the business of sanding down the rough spots, and this round is aimed at making the current content feel more reliable from moment to moment. That is a good sign, especially for players who have been sticking with the game through all of its updates and just want the whole thing to run cleaner without constantly getting in the way. And yeah, that is really the story here. This is not a giant reinvention patch, and it is not trying to be one. It is a stability and cleanup update that does a lot of unglamorous work in the background. And for a game like Starfield, that still counts for a lot. If you are out there building ships, running incursions, messing around with the new content, or just wandering planets and hoping the game stays out of your way, this kind of patch is exactly the sort of thing that makes the whole experience feel a little smoother. It is the difference between a play session that keeps moving and one that gets derailed by a weird freeze or a stuck objective, and that is worth more than people sometimes give it credit for.